Hello, welcome back. We're continuing our second part of sample surveys on chapter 11. So now we're going to talk about different ways that our surveys can go wrong, which are whenever our samples fail to represent the actual population itself. This is a result of bias, and there's lots of different ways that bias can be introduced into our sampling methods. So here's one example of that, the comic strip. Your new polls are in, Dad. Vast majority of household 6-year-olds say you're not living up to their expectations of fatherhood. That's what the survey says. What are their expectations? That you be more like an automatic teller machine, an ATM. Where do these pollsters find these respondents? So clearly, the only person he actually polled was himself, and he was really making an anecdotal claim and then saying that he had evidence behind it, but he didn't. All right, so we have our soup here. We have our population and our samples. So the population is the entire pot of soup. The things that we want to know about it is the population parameter. For instance, that could be whether or not it's salty enough, the viscosity, is it too thick or too thin, and then if the peas are done. Now, we don't want to have to eat the entire pot of soup in order to decide that, so instead we look at a sample. So we take our sample, we mix it up, and we hope that our sample is representative of the entire pot of soup. So we want to mix it up so that we ensure that whatever we had on the bottom is now on the top, and et cetera, so that we get some peas in our sample as well, and not all the salt is on the top, or it's thinner on the top, thicker on the bottom. All kinds of problems that we could have if we don't actually randomize it by stirring it up. Anyway, whatever we measure from the sample, we taste the saltiness, we decide if it's too thick or too thin, if we need to add water to it, etc., and then we decide if the peas are done based on our sample. Hopefully the sample is representative of the entire population so that we're done, and we could draw valid conclusions from our sample and then make adjustments to our soup as we move forward. The three ideas behind sampling is samples are supposed to be representations of the whole. So a sample is a subset of the subset of representatives from the population themselves. The sampling frame is the list of individuals from which the sample is selected. So it's all the possible people who could have been that are in the population that could have been selected. We want to make sure that we match the sampling frame to the population as best we can. So we want a list of all the people that we are interested in representing as best we can. It's not always possible. And then we want to randomize it. We randomize it in this example by stirring it up, right? So we're not just going to take whatever's on the top or sample from the bottom. We want to mix it up as best we can. The randomizing protects us from all the different types of bias, which is what we're going to talk about next. The sample size it's not important the fraction of the population, but rather the size of the sample that matters. That actually gives us the margin of errors that we set. So for instance, like I gave the example yesterday, if we have a population of 200 people and we sample 100 of those 200, that's going to give us the same margin of error as 100 people out of a population of 1,000,000 people. It's just the size of the sample that determines the margin of error, not the proportion of the sample. So we can actually draw very good conclusions or confidence intervals. We can build those based on rather small proportions of the entire population. So for instance, if we want to know how people are going to vote on election day or something like that, for example, we don't necessarily have to ask 10% of all voters. We can to get a good idea of what we think is going to happen. We just have to make sure that we are careful to remove bias by having good sampling methods, which is pretty interesting. So here's our population, here's our sampling frame, which is, let's say that we pour the soup into the bowl and then we're sampling from the bowl instead of sampling from the actual soup. Well, the issue here is that the sampling frame doesn't necessarily match the population because we're sampling from the sampling frame, not from the population itself. So if we're only calling up people who are registered voters, not the people who are going to vote, if there was same-day registration, then we would be missing out on all those people. So we couldn't claim that we knew what the people who were going to do same-day registration were going to, how they were going to vote, because we didn't actually include them in our sampling frame. The other thing that we have is that if we don't stir it, then it would be considered a bias sample if we don't use randomization. So in this case, our bias sample doesn't have any peas in it because we didn't stir it up, or we didn't make sure that we included all different locations or something like that. So if we only sampled people from, say, Oklahoma, and we didn't take in consideration people from Kansas or Colorado or something like that, then that would be a biased sample. It wouldn't necessarily be representative as well because it was missing the P's, right? So a representative sample should be very similar to, or representative really, of the sampling frame, and we want to make sure our sampling frame is as close to the population as possible, even though it's not always possible to make them exactly the same. All right, so different types of bias. Bias is the failure of a sampling method that over or underrepresents a portion of the population. So the first one, which is pretty common, is voluntary response bias. So when you sample volunteers, if you ask people to participate in your study instead of like actually kind of making them do it, then the only people that are going to respond probably are people that have really strong opinions about it, or people who are really bored. But we want to actually try to randomly select people and try to get a response for them as best we can, if at all possible. So not randomly selecting people, but allowing them to select or to volunteer for your poll, that's an issue. So you kind of get into some issues here. So for instance, if you have a poll on social media, like on Twitter or whatever, this is from a few years ago anyway, but Colin Cowherd asks, who is your midseason NBA MVP? And let's say that Colin Cowherd, let's say that a majority of the people who follow him are from the South and or from Texas or something, and they're Rockets fans, then they're probably going to vote more for James Harden. And then if he didn't have a lot of fans that were on the West Coast, like in LA, that would be voting for Steph Curry, Durant, or LeBron James, who are all on the West Coast, right? So that could give you issues because he's not actually sampling everyone or everyone from every state, or it's not evenly distributed for all the people who are going to be voting. If he's primarily let's say does commentary for the Rockets, or he lives in Texas or something like that, then you'd have issues. Also, whoever chose to respond to this poll is not just the people who, well, possibly could be the people who are going to be voting or the ones who go out of their way to vote. But if it's people not voting for the MVP, but it's some committee that's voting for the MVP, then you'd really just need to ask some people who are in the committee. The other thing is if you're on YouTube and you have polls that pop up on there when you're watching your cat videos, because that's how you do, the only people who are going to respond to those are people who are interested or have strong opinions about it. So you might get two polarizing opinions about whether they really like this video or they really don't, not necessarily all those middle of the road responses, which is what you would actually be representative of what people are thinking about it. So the next one we have is undercoverage bias. So undercoverage bias is leaving out a segment of the population in the sampling strategy, which would be being left out of the sampling frame. So for instance, if you mailed out surveys, it would leave out anyone who doesn't have a physical address, so they wouldn't have a chance to respond. So for instance, people in the military who are living on base somewhere else in another country, or people who are homeless who don't have a mailing address, or people who are incarcerated. So we can't claim to represent the opinions of people who are not on our sampling frame who don't have a chance to even be selected, like people in the military who are homeless or who are incarcerated. This would be what we call undercoverage bias. Non-response bias is when you have a large portion of people who do not respond to your survey. So if you mail out millions and millions of surveys through the mail and only a certain percent of them actually come back, that's not the way to do it. So again, it's kind of like voluntary response in that case as well. So this occurs when the answers of the respondents different from those who didn't respond. So of course, if the people who responded are representative of the people who didn't respond, then you don't have an issue. But the people that responded, let's say they were more passionate about the issue or something like that, they would be more likely to respond. And the people who were indifferent, who ended up not voting for the proposition or something, then you would have an issue. So this happens when you choose somebody to be a part, randomly select somebody to be a part of your survey, but they don't actually answer. So what we need to do is we need to actually attempt to track them down. So they were randomly selected, whether they want to do it or not, we really need to find out their opinion. So you got to pull Liam Neeson, right? You've got a certain set of skills that make me someone you don't want to cross. So if I call you, you better answer, and you got to track them down and try to get their opinion as best you can, because it's important. So if they don't answer, call back another time. You can't just call during the day, because then people who work during the day might not answer. You can't just call at night, because then people who work nights wouldn't answer. So you got to call at different times, etc. So there's a lot that goes into sampling and surveying, and companies can make a lot of money by either telling people what they want to hear, which is kind of funny, or by actually trying to be accurate with their polling and give people a good idea of what's going to happen. So they have really good methods. Some of them have not so good methods. All right, convenience sampling. So just like you can imagine, like a convenience store, convenience sampling is convenient, but it's not a good way to do sampling. So a survey on the internet found 99% of people had access to the internet. Do you see the issue with that? Of course, if you put a survey on the internet, the only people who are going to be able to see the survey are people who have access to the internet. So this is a worthless poll, right? So we have to be really, really careful about this. Even though it would be convenient just to post something on the internet, you got to find other ways. Even though it would be convenient just to go outside of Walmart and ask people's opinion as they walk out, we might want to know the opinions of people who don't go to Walmart. For instance, if you're working for Walmart and you want to increase the amount of people who come into Walmart, you might want to try getting the opinion of people who shop at a competitor like Target. And so if you only gather the opinion of people who are who go to Walmart, then yeah, you're doing great. But you really want to bring the people over who are shopping in a different store, who refuse to shop at your store because of some issue or something like that. All right, so don't do convenience sampling. So we must have a defined sampling frame, which is a list of people that we're trying to contact. We can't just let people come to us or anything like that. And a way to randomize a sample, not just what's convenient. For this reason and voluntary response bias, internet convenience polls are worthless and should not be trusted. So if you have been on Facebook or something and you took a poll and then you saw, oh, wow, it seems like a lot of people who agree with me, or this is interesting, these results, you should not trust online polls like at all, because again, voluntary response, and they weren't randomly selected. The only people who respond are people who actually feel strongly about it, or who have no life and just want to do it. So you're missing out the opinions of all the people who don't go to that website, or et cetera, et cetera. So be very, very, very careful about that. Take it with a grain of salt. So all but 2% of the buyers have at least one computer at home. 62% have two or more. Of those with a computer, 99% are connected to the internet. So that was the actual study. Somebody posted that, which is absolutely stupid. But there's a lot of stupid out there with stats, by the way. So be smarter than the average bear. All right, example 1. Manufacturers and advertising agencies often use interviews at shopping malls to gather information about customer habits and the effectiveness of the ads. A sample of mall shoppers is fast and cheap. How might this survey be biased? So again, same example. Let's say you work for Nike and you just get people that are coming into Nike. The issue is you've already won those people and brought them in with advertisements. And so you really are kind of only getting the opinion of the stuff that's working, instead of actually going to people who are shopping at Adidas or some other competitor like Reebok or something, and then trying to figure out how to bring those people to your store by gathering their opinion on what they're interested in. So it's kind of confirmation bias, which is something completely different, but it's the issue that you would get into here. So we need to make sure that we are targeting our demographic or whatever, and building a sample frame based on that, and then randomly selecting people to get their opinion. So don't just let them come to you and do voluntary response bias or convenience sampling. All right, enough said. Now, the most juicy one of all is response bias. And this one's a lot of fun, actually, and it's probably going to ruffle some feathers, but I got to do it. The book does a really good job of explaining it, and this is probably one of the most common issues that we have. So very timely as well. So response bias is whenever you ask a question that might be incriminating to somebody, or makes somebody uncomfortable, and leads them in the wording towards one response and over the other one. So for instance, if you were asked a question, if someone went up to you and you were a small business owner or something like that, and they asked you, would you hire someone who has tattoos, visible tattoos? And you see the guy who's interviewing you or asking you this question, this poll question, has net tax and sleeves and everything like that. Even if you deep down inside wouldn't hire this guy or somebody who had visible tattoos because you didn't want them representing your brand or for whatever reason, you're probably not going to say that to their face because clearly this person has tattoos, right? My brother was actually, when he got let off, he was going around and applying for like every job that he could. He has 2 degrees, and yet he was applying. And one of the places that to restaurants and stuff, and one of the places he applied to was an Asian restaurant, and the owners told him they were looking for not an overweight white man to be a server, but rather a young Asian female. And I thought that was absolutely hilarious. It is actually racial discrimination and hiring practices. But they don't know that you can't say that, which is kind of funny. Anyway, so again, you're more likely to tell somebody something that you think that they would want to hear instead of actually perhaps telling them the truth, especially when you got this guy with the cross-armed, sleeved arms there. All right, so the other question is, what's the fastest that you've ever driven? So if you're asking me, I mean, I'm not going to be stupid enough to like incriminate myself on the internet, but even though I've said lots of stupid things, but surprise, surprise. If you're having a conversation with your friends, you might be honest and tell them, or you might even lie and tell them you've gone faster than you actually have. But if you're being asked that question by an adult person in authority, or you're a potential employer, you're less likely to tell the truth, right? Especially if you're being asked that question by a police officer, right? So how fast were you going? Or do you know how fast you're going? Oh, I have no idea how fast I was going, officer. Whatever your excuses might be, right? So it's going to be a different story depending on who's asking you. And this would be a type of response bias because you're not wanting to incriminate yourself in the responses. So if you ask people about illicit drug use, or about like if they're a drink and drive or something like that, people are going to be hesitant to answer these things honestly because unless it's being done anonymously, because they don't want to incriminate themselves, right? And they're going to want to tell you what you want to hear, depending on how you come off. So an example of response bias, then we'll get into the really juicy stuff. So response bias is when the wording of a survey or question influences the way you respond from an accurate or truthful response. So telling people what you want to hear, or oversimplifying issues. I'll get to that one in a minute. All right, so even subtle differences in phrasing can make a difference. So in January 2006, the New York Times asked half of the 1,229 U.S. adults in their sample the following question. After 9/11, President Bush authorized government wiretaps on some phones in the U.S. without getting court warrants. This was the Patriot Act, in case you're curious, saying this was necessary to reduce the threat of terrorism. So again, right after 9/11. Do you approve or disapprove of this? They found that 53% of respondents approved when they worded it that way. But then when they asked the other half of their sample, the question with only slightly different phrasing, they said, after 9/11, George W. Bush authorized government wiretaps on some phone calls in the U.S. without getting court warrants. Do you approve or disapprove of this? Now that they're mentioning that they did it without court warrants, and they are not saying that the whole point of it was to reduce the threat of terrorism, you can see how this would be biased or kind of leaning people towards, oh, that sounds terrible. Of course you have to have a warrant. And this sounds, even unconstitutional, which some would argue that it was. Do you approve or disapprove of this? Now they found that only 46% of people approved. So why is there so much variation between the two groups? Well, part of it is because of the way that they worded the question. One of them, they were trying to defend what President Bush was doing by giving justifications. The other one was trying to show the other side. So is it really even possible to ask questions in an unbiased way that isn't showing, kind of playing your hand on, do you prefer this or do you prefer this? Or if you can't reword a question, then you should actually ask half of them one way and the other half the other way, and then kind of take the average of those two. So there's lots of different methods that pollsters use, but we want to try to use as a neutral of language and not incriminate or not lead them towards any sort of thing. So we might just simply ask them, and after 9/11, President Bush authorized the government wiretaps on some phone calls. Do you approve of this? Boom. So leave out anything that might defend or point out any issues that somebody sees in this. So anyway, moving on. All right, so another form of response bias. So in our current political climate, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, it's kind of hectic out there, right? And so if you ask somebody if they were a Democrat or Republican, do you think that they would be honest about it? Specifically, if they were of a certain political persuasion, is it really a safe space to be be one of these things. Like, so we have a lot of diversity and we love diversity, but do we value diversity of thought? Do we allow other people to disagree with us and still learn to get along with them in America? Good question. And so we constantly find polls and pollsters are off about politics. They were off 4 years ago really bad, and they were off really bad this last election as well. I think part of the reason why they're off is because there's not necessarily a safe space for people who are among a certain political persuasion. They find themselves under attack in a lot of ways, and so they're likely just to lie to you. And so that would lead the pollsters to be off and to think that something was going to happen that didn't actually happen. So here's another example of response bias, and this is the worst of it. Like this slide, I hate this slide. And it really just kind of sums up what's wrong with politics, right? So when the wording of a survey or question influences the way you respond, away from accurate or truthful response, so telling you what you want to hear or oversimplifying the issues. So this is semantic overload is a word that we would use for it when we have one phrase has multiple meanings and multiple things tied to it. It's not just the words themselves, but actual like positions that are backing those words. We also have something called a euphemism, which is like a nice word or a nice saying for something that's actually kind of controversial. So we're trying to like gloss over some things that might be a little controversial. And so there's actually two different sides of this. These are yard signs, of course. It's called "In This House We Believe" signs. So obviously you have one from the left and the one from the right. Both of these I find to be rather disgusting, and they kind of oversimplify the issues. I'm not even going to read them to you because they just one of them is bound to offend you if it's not both of them. But basically they're not allowing for, if you disagree with that statement, it makes it seem like, well, I mean, you're not even like a good human anymore, because of course you have to believe that this is this, right? Or something along those lines. So a personal story. A teacher proudly posted one of these two, I won't tell you which one, "In These House We Believe" posters in the classroom. When asked if they thought their political views might alienate their students who disagree with their political views, their response was they failed to see how their poster was political, which is incredible. Of course it is. Rather thought that the poster was simply stating basic human values. So essentially, this is not political. This is what basic human values are. And if you disagree with me, then you lack basic human values. And therefore, you can punch a Nazi in the face. So do you believe that your students who disagree, so I asked the teacher, do you believe that the students that disagree with your political stance on controversial issues lack basic human values? And how do you think that would make your students feel? Do the statements in the posters represent the political issues in an unbiased way? So are we actually trying to give people what the issues are and let them decide on their own, or are we trying to persuade them in the way that we kind of coerce or gloss over the phrasing with euphemisms and semantic overload in the way that we word these? Are they worded in a way that oversimplify difficult issues and belittle, and this is terrible, but they belittle opposing viewpoints of people that might disagree with us? All right, so now that we've all been uncomfortable, I'm going to lighten the mood with another example of response bias. So when the wording of a survey or question influences the way that you respond away from accurate or truthful responses, telling what you want to hear over simplifying the issue. So, Wizard of Id. So how would you rate the king's job performance? Would you say that he's doing a good job, an outstanding job, or a terrific job? And then he responded, "I think I know who's paying for this poll." So clearly they're being persuaded just in the wording of it. They really don't have any negative options. It's either good, outstanding, or terrific, so you know who's paying for the poll. So kind of fun. Another example of response bias. All right, example 2, Ann Landers was curious about her readers' opinion on being a parent, so she asked her readers in her advice column, if you had to do it over again, would you have children? She received nearly 10,000 responses, and almost 70% of the parents said no, they would not have children again, which sounds terrible, right? I know your parents don't regret having children. Of course, parents don't regret having children. At least mine don't, because I'm a perfect child and everything. But all right, a more carefully designed survey later showed that about 90% of parents are actually happy with their decision to have children. So what accounts for the striking difference between 10% and 70% in the two results? So what parents do you think are most likely to respond to the original question. So if you were just reading the advice column, right, about parenting, and you're frustrated with your teenager, and you see that poll that pops up, would you have children again? You might be like, gosh, I brought you into this world, I'd take you out of it. Those parents are probably who are frustrated, and the heat of the moment are more likely to be passionate about it and to answer the poll and to say, no, I would not have children again. But in the long run, after their cooler heads prevail and they sleep on it, the next day they're like, all right, yeah, it's pretty awesome. Of course, I didn't actually mean that. And so whenever they actually sampled all the parents and they didn't just do a voluntary response, convenient sample on the internet, they found that about 90% of parents are actually happy with their decision to have children. Only 10% of them regret it. That's still terrible. Okay, so anyway, that basically what we have here is response bias and a convenience sample. So again, issues. All right, moving on. Number 9. So researchers waited outside every bar they had randomly selected from a list of such establishments. They stopped every 10th person who came out of the bar and asked whether he or she thought that drinking and driving was a serious problem. They go to a bar to ask their opinions. All right, identify the following items if possible. If you can't tell, simply say so. So what is their population? So we're trying to we're trying to see, I suppose, if people over the age of 21 believe that drinking and driving is an issue, or if just voting American adults or people in the city or the county or the state, whatever, I don't know. It just depends. The sampling frame is only the people who went to the bars. So because those were the only people that had the option of even being selected, so only the people that went to the bars on that day. The population parameter of interest, what we're wanting to know about the population is whether or not people's opinion on drinking and driving, if they think it's a serious issue. The sample is going to be the actual people that were selected, so every 10th person that came out of those bars that they went to. The sampling method, this is a systematic sampling method because we're doing every 10th one. We also randomly, so there's randomization because we randomly selected the bars that they went to. So randomization was employed in that way. Any potential sources of bias? Yeah, there's a huge amount of undercoverage. So they're not asking the opinions of people who don't go to the bar. And so they're probably not likely to think there's much of an issue. If you have a bunch of drunk people coming out, of course, I'm a good driver. I drive great. I'm a high functioning alcoholic, you need to get an Uber, sir, or a taxi. So kind of a funny thing. So any source of bias, yeah, we have undercoverage bias of all the people who don't go to the bars. Do you feel confident that this is a representative sample, that we can generalize it to the population of interest? No, unless you're only trying to see if people who go to the bar think that it's an issue, then that population you could probably do that. But if you want to generalize it to all the people who go to bars and not go to bars, this would not be a good way to do it. Roadblock. State police set up a roadblock to estimate the percentage of cars with up-to-date registration, insurance, safety, inspection stickers. Would it be it would be too inconvenient and costly to check every vehicle that passes through the checkpoint. So instead they decided to stop about 1/20th of the vehicles. Why would a roadblock be better than using a simple random sample with a sampling frame of all vehicles registered to state? Well, the problem with using the registrations is that if we're trying to check for cars that are not registered, then clearly if we only go to the ones that are registered and use that as our sampling frame, then we're not going to catch the people who are not registered. Same thing with insurance. If we only go through the insurance companies to build our list, then all the people who are not insured are obviously not going to be on our list. So that would be the issue that we would have there. Okay, so how could they use a systematic sampling method to select 1/20th of the cars you pass through? Well, you just simply, for every lane that you have, you just stop every 20th car and check them, and then let the other next 19 cars go through. And that would be a systematic way of doing that. All right, 30 minutes. We are done. Sorry, it was a little bit long. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussion. Also, you can always read the textbook if you want to go back and learn this vocab. This whole unit is very, very vocabulary heavy. So go back, dwell on it, and let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys later.